Jane? Okay. Did you record to the cloud?
Yes, yes, I did.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, well, welcome to the 2023 season of Great Decisions, and we're very pleased to welcome two new discussants, Lynn Edmonds and Doug Dawson. I think everyone else is an old timer. As usual, Jack and I will share the moderating role with Jack taking the lead today on energy. So, and we have a bonus for you at the end. So don't go away. We have a special additional component.
I'd just like to once again recite a couple of ground rules. Those of you who are observers, please mute yourselves so that Ulf, who is in the BVI, can have a prominent position on the screen and he can participate in our discussions. Secondly, for the discussants here, if you'd please raise your hand when you'd like to speak, as opposed to just blurting it out. There are a lot of people who have comments and questions. A lot of times we like to have follow-up questions and discussion, but I want to give everybody a chance to speak. And so if you will raise your hand, I'll try as best I can to recognize you in order. So the topic today is energy geopolitics. And what I thought might be interesting, there seems to me at least to be three components here. There's an energy discussion, there's a political or economic discussion, and then there is a climate change discussion, and they're all interwoven. And I thought we might discuss each of those components separately and then try to put them together in terms of a foreign policy position. So the first thing I'd like to do is just an editorial comment. What did you think of the book? What did you think of the reading? Was it helpful? Was it useful? Was it bipartisan? How did you find it? Did anybody read it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Charles.
I found, as Dan knows, I found the introduction to be misleading, and I thought the article was not particularly useful.
But
Not
Andrew,
I found that 15-minute introduction to be not useful, and
Are you talking about the reading or the DVD?
and the reading itself, I found the reading not particularly helpful.
Okay, Doug?
I like both of them as a general comment. I thought that the reading was a little on the liberal side, and I thought the video presentation was on the conservative side. So I'm kind of getting two views on it.
Okay. Any other comments?
Yeah, I thought that the reading was weaker than the presentation.
Interesting.
Weaker.
Yeah, Ron.
I think the reading was good. I got things out of it that changed my views on a few things.
Yeah, I would say from my own perspective, I thought the reading was better balanced than a lot of the readings that we have done in the past. You thought the reading was a little on the liberal side. Wait till you see some of the other stuff you get to read. Nancy.
I thought the descriptions of the security, energy security, were particularly interesting in the reading. I don't think I've seen as many versions of what it means. Excuse me?
Yeah.
Bob
I'll take.
Kelly, please
Still
mute
stop
yourself.
now. It's not doing it. It's not doing it.
Bob, please mute.
Or Jane, please mute Bob Tortelli.
I did. That's my job. You don't have to pay attention.
Thank you, Jane.
Okay. And Ulf, did you get a chance to read the material? I'm not sure if you have a book or not.
I have a book and I read the material and I found it, for me, it was interesting and a pretty comprehensive description of what we're
from Virgin Islands.
But then I looked at the internet also. The questions you were sending were quite good to have as a starter.
Okay, well, we'll see how the answers come out. Yeah, Dean.
I was disappointed in the reading. I was looking for something really profound about here's where we are, and I didn't get that.
Okay.
And Lord knows it's a very complicated subject and subject to a great many different opinions about what to do. But I was disappointed.
Okay, well, let's move on. Yeah, Lynn.
I wouldn't say I was disappointed, but I thought that some of the facts and the numbers don't seem to be as up to date as they should be.
Well, they should be up to date as of November of 2022,
I know,
which is when this was
but-
written.
And I would agree on some ways, for instance, you know, it really downplays a lot of what China is doing right now.
Yeah, there wasn't a great deal of emphasis on China.
No, and in fact, it almost blames the United States for being a polluter. When we know that, you know, India, Russia, and especially China are really the ones that are contributing to worldwide climate change.
Well, each of us brings something to the party, and then the book amplifies or diminishes what you bring to the party. And so I think it's reasonable that everybody has a different opinion, and that's fine. I just wanted to get a little sense as to how satisfied or dissatisfied you were with the material that was sent out. Let's go to the meat of the subject, and the first part of the discussion I would like to focus on is energy. And the question is, you know, why is energy important? Why are we talking about energy? What's significant about energy in a geopolitical sense? Is it important?
It's the basis of our economy. World economy.
Basis of our economy?
World economy.
Okay. Can you think of anything that we either do or consume or use or drive or fly or whatever in that is not energy dependent? Just the whole spectrum, whether it's food, whether it's drink, whether it's automobiles, whether it's transportation, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's international trade, anything that doesn't have an energy component. Doug.
Only in the middle of the Brazilian jungle.
Well,
And even then, maybe, I don't know.
How do they
I
cook
think
their
you have
food?
to be pretty well off the grid before, and then people can live off the grid.
how do they cook their food in the Brazilian jungle?
I would assume they use fires, but I don't
And
know.
what is fire?
Well, okay, that's wood. Very good.
No, I think that, you know, it's important in terms of setting this tone for this discussion to recognize that energy is really critical to the human well-being. And since the time that we started walking erect, we've been using energy in one form or another, transforming energy from one form to another. And so it affects everything that we do in our lives, and certainly everything from a geopolitical standpoint has an energy component to it. Some are more dramatic than others, but it's certainly important. It's been said that electricity is the lifeblood of civilization. Do you buy that?
Pretty
Well,
much,
yes.
yes.
Okay,
I
so
think really one of the
Yes.
keys is how do we make electricity be the lifeblood? That's almost where we are right now.
well, and that's subject to a lot of controversy, as you know.
Yep.
Yeah, Carol.
And it's vital to our national security, and each nation feels that way too.
Okay, I agree with that. What is energy independence? What is energy dependence?
But we would,
Yeah,
Well,
Ron?
many countries are bereft of the kind of energy that we have in this country. I mean, we're pretty much independent on fossil fuels mostly, but there are some countries that, Japan is a good example. They went to war because of energy in the Second World War.
Tell us about that. How did that happen? What actions did Japan take in the Second World War that occasioned the Second World War?
Well, they attacked the Philippines, Indonesia, places that had oil, which they needed, and they didn't have it. Now, their whole position in this geopolitical thing changes because now, with good science, they can get into the new energies and change their whole economy. I think Japan is going to be a big country of change in this time that we're.
And what are these new energies that they're getting into?
Well, solar, wind, I mean, all the white nuclear, well, nuclear, they had a disaster, but they did get into it. And, so I think Japan is one country that's changing most dramatically because of energy.
In fact, I think energy is probably the most fundamental political component of anything, statecraft or or science. Energy is it. In fact, to your question about the Second World War, the Second World War started well, in June of 1941. The Japanese foreign minister gave a speech about Japan has 6 months of fuel left to run. Go forward 6 months and you get to December 7th.
Who had been supplying Japan with energy prior to June of 1941? Who?
US.
The US. And it was really our actions that cut them off. That then made them go try to find alternative supplies, in which they really found Indonesia. And that was the source of energy that they then coveted, which started the war. Charles.
I mean, you can go back further a little bit. Germany invading Russia, and that area was the drive was to get the oil from Russia in the Baku
Well,
area.
I think the Germans' intrusion was more about food insecurity than it was about energy. But it was certainly, it certainly had a component. Bulgaria was a place where they were really looking for energy because it had the refineries. But the point is well made here, is that energy is a dominant force that has been geopolitically important for a long time. What is energy dependence? What does that mean? That's Nancy.
Well, it means you don't produce enough to sustain what you need for your own society.
So then what do you do?
Well, you either trade or you buy, and many places there is neither capacity. They don't have anything to trade for or with, and they don't have the money to buy. So
Okay, and is there a third alternative that we just discussed?
Invade. And in fact, to continue with the Second World War issue, the second component of December 7th was the Japanese military, whatever they were, chief of the army staff said, we cannot, we need to invade Southwest Asia to get the fuel that we need. To be able to do attack and invade Southwest Asia and capture that, we need to demolish the American battleship fleet. And so bomb Pearl Harbor, kill the battleships, and then invade
Go for a quick
Southwest
victory.
Asia.
Doug, you had your hand up?
Just different word, conquers what they say.
I just to bring it up to present, that's appears to be the Putin approach to the war in Ukraine, to destroy the energy infrastructure in the Ukraine and get rid of the electricity, and hopefully that will force the Ukrainians to back down.
Well, that introduces another term that's in the book here, and that's called weaponizing energy. What is weaponizing energy?
That.
Well, is it just sending missiles into Ukraine, or is it more than that?
Sanctions.
Sanctions, what else? Doug? Wait,
Well, as a general statement, is using energy exports as blackmail to get something. Or the converse of that is using weapons to go get your energy.
There are two forms of weaponizing energy. One is cyber and the other is kinetic. Everybody understands what kinetic means? You know, it actually means physical activity. So what are the ways that you could weaponize energy from a kinetic standpoint or from a cyber standpoint? Bob?
Well, the second kinetic, I think, is attacking infrastructure.
Certainly part of that, but you could attack the infrastructure from a cyber standpoint as well, would you not?
Yeah.
And so, you know, the whole concept of weaponizing energy, you know, is being dramatically brought to our attention on a daily basis as to what's going on in Ukraine, what has gone on with respect to Russia's attitude on supplying Western Europe, and what is our response been. So that has been a critical aspect of this war. Charles?
There's another element of this that is not associated with war, which is energy resilience. A piece of, we saw this in Texas a couple of years ago when storms wiped out the Texas energy supply. Part of the infrastructure bill just passed is designed to harden the American grid.
What's the grid?
The grid is what all the high tension wires, the transmission of energy from place to place, which is very vulnerable. So you don't even need war, but floods, hurricanes. And our energy grid apparently is quite vulnerable both to cyber and to, it's kind of rickety. And so a large piece of the recent bill, infrastructure bill, is designed to encourage. One of the problems, of course, is our energy is distributed. There's no national policy. So each state has their own rules and regulations. Each Indian reservation has their own rules and regulations. So it's not.
Do we have a national grid?
So we do not really have a national grid. That
Was
is,
it ever?
it's a regional grid and part of the energy the bill. And there's a whole big DOE task force now designed to work with it to try to harden the grid.
Well, the point is, it was never designed to be a national grid. There are
Right.
5 principal components to the grid, which are supposedly interconnected, but the interconnection is pretty terrible. And so we do not have the capacity to move electricity from a generation position such as in Appalachia to a consuming position such as in Chicago. That, we can piece it together, but that's not what the grid was designed for, and that's where it's vulnerable. Okay, well, what are the different forms of energy that are consumed? Yeah?
Read them here. Wood, I'm going in start. to
Shouldn't have given
finish.
you the answer.
Wood, yeah, wood, coal, petroleum, gas, solar, wind, nuclear, geothermal, and ocean tides. That's what I came up with.
And which of those are considered to be fossil fuels?
Petroleum, gas, and coal.
How about wood?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I keep forgetting wood.
Yeah, I mean,
We can't burn it anymore here, so.
well, you can in some places, but anyway, where do fossils come from? I mean, how do we get this fossil fuel,
Compression of dead material.
including wood?
Sure. Yeah, including wood, that's
Yeah,
true.
and and within that spectrum of oil, gas, et cetera, is there a difference? Are all oils the same are all gases the same? What's the difference between pipeline gas and LNG?
Amount of BTUs it gives you, and I think maybe the carbon, the CO2 that's generated, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, the chemistry component is basically the same, but there's a physical component that makes them very, very different.
Compression?
Well, pipeline gas is transmitted with a pipeline, so it's geographically contained. Okay, LNG is liquefied natural gas. That's what it stands for. It can be compressed, liquefied, put into a tanker and transported around the world. So LNG can be a vehicle for international diplomacy, international power, whereas pipeline gas is pretty much restricted to the geography that it's produced in. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how oil and gas are controlled. What are the controlling mechanisms? How is supply and demand regulated here? Who sets the price? Who sets the amount of oil or gas produced? How does all that work? I mean, we've established that this is probably the most important commodity that we have, not just in this country, but in the world. And it's subject to a lot of angst when you go to the gas station and fill up your car. You're either happy or you're unhappy, or you're somewhere in the middle. How does all that work? What's the mechanism? Is it government control? Yeah,
Well,
Ron.
I think at the beginning, before climate control was an issue, the government wasn't as involved, and supply and demand determined how much oil and gas was produced either by OPEC or by the United States or any country that had it. I think then, once we started with talk about climate control, the government came into this in a bigger way than it was in the past, as far as I can see. And in the United States, the government has been sort of pro-climate control.
So supply and demand is out the window now?
Well,
Supply and demand is no longer relevant?
it's less now than it was. I think
I
now you
disagree.
have the government closing the Keystone Pipeline, which means you can't get oil from Canada down to.
So does that have an effect on supply or demand?
Well, supply. But
Okay, it did have an effect on supply.
And it's a government sort of cutting down on the supply.
Well, if I can see your picture, do you have something to say?
Yeah, supply and demand. I mean, during COVID, you had the zero price on oil, the future market. So supply and demand, I beg your pardon?
You said it was actually negative at one point. in
Yes,
time.
you are correct. So definitely the market and expectations there are the dominating factor.
So supply and demand really does work. Government has intruded in supply and demand, but it still is a very important factor in pricing. Charles?
Yeah, but I would sort of take a little issue with just what Ron said. Because the government has always in this country, the Texas Oil Commission, we had
Railroad
lots of
Commission.
oil over periods of time, and it's always been regulated, sometimes to the benefit of the producers who did not want the glut of oil. And I think some of that ended up being arrogated to the states. I think the Texas Oil Commission, I'm trying to remember, and
It
maybe
was
the
the Texas
Oklahoma,
Railroad Commission.
the Texas Railroad Commission, and the federal government kind of deferred to them to control.
Well, did the federal government ever play a real role in this factor? I mean, wasn't it always regional until more recently?
It was always regional but it was always, there was never a time when in fact government, whether state or federal, didn't sometimes to help and sometimes to hinder, depending on what was needed. What has changed now though, is in past years, it was more economic where government controlled how much oil came because you had a glut, as opposed to a scarcity, but now it's become weaponized as an international kind of thing. And so therefore, government is playing a different role from economic to strategic.
Okay, Nancy and then Ron.
Yeah, I just wanted to introduce the strategic petroleum reserve
Good,
as another factor in this supply.
excellent. How does it
demand.
fit in?
Well, it's a backstop, I guess I would say, for the supply and demand.
Was it
aspect.
designed to control price or for other purposes?
I think it was designed to control supply, not more than price.
It was much more designed to take case of a real emergency, an aberration where our industry or our economy was deprived of oil and we had to fill. It was not designed to stabilize price,
Correct, but it has been used that way.
unfortunately. Ron?
What I just wanted to say is that previously, if you go back to when Roosevelt met with Saudi Arabia to try to work out a deal on oil, it was the government of the United States wanting to assure that we always had a supply. It wasn't the government of the United States trying to control the supply by knocking it down as
Right.
is more being done today.
And what do we trade for the supply assurance?
What's that?
What did Roosevelt offer?
Well, defending Saudi Arabia essentially
Yeah.
against their energy.
And it wasn't just the United States that he was arguing for, it was the Western world. That
And
at that point, this is the prelude to the Yalta conference. And he offered the deal, we will be your security if you will be our supply.
yeah, but in that
And
case.
how long did that last?
It still essentially
Did
did
it
until
ever
maybe
break?
the oil embargo in the
It grew,
'70s.
it grew.
What fractured? that-
Israeli Arab War, 1973.
And what was that better known as? The Yom Kippur War. Okay, and what happened in that? Why did, first of all, who was OPEC? And then what happened as a result of that break?
Did OPEC, I don't think OPEC existed back then.
Yes, it did.
In 73?
Yeah.
So that's when
Okay, but nevertheless, what happened?
We supported Israel.
Correct.
Therefore, OPEC cut the oil supply off to the United States.
And what was the result of that?
Big gas lines.
And every other refined
Yeah,
product,
right, exactly.
right? And has that ever happened since then, or is that a one-time event and now we're kumbaya with OPEC?
Lots of
Good question, yeah.
It happened again. It actually had, there were two occasions where our supply was cut off. One was in the early 70s, one was the later 70s, 1978. And you didn't suffer as much in 78 as you did in 72, 73, but there was a second oil embargo at that point in time. Who was OPEC plus? Now we have OPEC plus. Who are they?
Well,
Iran.
Russia is joined. in.
Russia.
And that's a big-
And why is Russia significant in terms of this equation?
They have.
Who are the three largest oil producers in the world?
United States, OPEC, well, Saudi
Saudi
Arabia. and
Arabia
Russia.
and Russia. All of those countries, those three countries all produce about 11 or 12 million barrels a day. And the United States at one point in time had departed from that club, was down to about 8 or 9 million barrels a day. And then in the around 2008, we reemerged as a significant oil producer, and we were producing as many as 14 million barrels a day when you got into around 2018, 2019. What caused this reemergence? How did we all of a sudden go
Fracking.
from, what is it?
Fracking,
What's fracking?
breaking up shale to release
Naturally.
gas that's in the shale.
Gas and what else? Oil.
Well, I know.
Okay.
Sure.
And was there another complementary technology that went along with fracking that allowed us to do this?
Oh, liquefaction of the gas.
Okay.
So that you could.
I'm thinking more of horizontal drilling.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
where all of a sudden we learned how to whipstock a drill bit and turn it horizontally so that you could intrude into a shale formation, break it up, frack it, and then produce the oil or gas, whatever is there. And is that important? Is that going on today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bob,
US was the leader.
we've been fracking for at least 60 years in tight gas sands in the Gulf of Mexico. The revolutionary thing was A, applying it to shale, and B, marrying it with horizontal drilling. That's what changed things. Doug.
I just have a question on that. I have a buddy who wanted to go into the fracking business and shale back in the sixties, as soon as he got out of college, because the technology, the idea was there. What changed to make that? We didn't use it then. Why did we not use it then? Was some technology come along other than the?
No, we had been using fracking in tight gas sands in the Gulf of Mexico since about 1958, 1960, something like that. So it's an old technology. But at that point in time, you drilled a vertical well, and then you injected chemicals and water under high pressure to break up the tight gas sand. You then would use silicon or small glass beads or sand to push into the fractures that you just created to keep them open. And then it would allow the gas or the oil to flow because it would be open. That technology has been around for a long, long time. The real breakthrough was, first of all, because of permeability and porosity, we could only drill essentially in sand. Now we learned how to extract oil from shale. Shale is, you normally have a geological sandwich where you have sandstone, shale, and so on down the line. But now we have learned how to extract oil from shale as opposed to just sandstone, and that's a big change.
Is there a downside to the increasing use of fracking?
Sure.
I mean, the upside is very obvious. It's made us independent. What's the downside?
Affects water supply,
How?
contamination.
How? How is it different than any other production? Anybody? Ron? I mean, Charles?
Well, I mean, it requires enormous amounts of water, but also they're down part of downside areas. So with earthquakes, because in unstable areas.
How does that work?
Presumably you would know this better than I, but presumably the fracking takes an unstable area and makes it more unstable. And so in Oklahoma, in some areas, there are small earthquakes.
Yeah, it's not actually from the fracking, it's from the re-injection of the fluid
Right.
back into the structure. And there are areas, as you say, in Oklahoma, which are particularly vulnerable to that. So if you try to re-inject fluids, spent fluids under high pressure, you can cause
Destabilize an area, right?
Nancy.
So I'm just curious what the implication of the objections to fracking. There seemed to, as I recall, there was a big movement
Right.
against it. And partly, I think, for some of the reasons of the side effects of the use of water, the instability. But I don't recall, nor am I clear if that's all gone, it feels like it's reduced because of the value that fracking, it's sort of outweighed
New
the.
York State still will not allow fracking to take place within the confines of the state of New York because of supposed objections.
Yeah.
So it's still real.
But right next door to New York, you have Pennsylvania.
Correct.
Doing a large amount of fracking and helping their economy, and they don't seem to be having much problem as far as I can.
A lot of this, in my opinion, is due to lack of information, maybe a little bit of hysteria, maybe a little bit of political gamesmanship. But from an inherent standpoint, there's nothing wrong with fracking. Nothing wrong with producing along these lines. In terms of the problem with gas going into formations or into your water supply or whatever, in the industry, the only reason that could happen is what we would call a bad cement job. When you drill a well, you create a cement casing to ward off intrusion into the water supply. If you have a bad cement job, and even the most liberal columnists will acknowledge this, then you can have intrusion. But other than a bad cement job, there's no real difference.
Well, I mean. Possibility go undone, and just leaving it there. If anybody can try to explain that, I'd like to know why. Who believes New York is doing the right thing?
Okay, go around the table. Who believes New York is who thinks we should deny access to oil and gas reserves that can be accessed because of fracking and horizontal drilling? Anyone? So apparently
I don't know enough.
Yeah, that's.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
But I have another comment. Another thing that's a negative about fracking is I remember Time Magazine publishing these pictures of northern Canada, I think it was Alberta, where they have these huge fields where they're doing all the fracking. And it is a mess. And in Colorado, you have the same issue, huge ponds, I mean, monster ponds, I don't know, square miles of these things.
Yeah, let's be clear. The large areas in Alberta are really the production from the Athabasca tar sands. And it doesn't have anything to do with fracking. Fracking, the most prolific area, northern region that is being fracked is in North Dakota. Unfortunately, there's a lot of politicizing. There's a lot of hysteria that goes on. And sometimes you will see pictures and articles that are somewhat disassociated from the facts. But be that as it may, let's move on. How do we think that the technologies that we're using today are going to be around 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years from now? Is everything going to be static?
No,
Carol.
it's constantly evolving.
Okay.
Even a nuclear, a more abbreviated nuclear a component that can be, where it does not take the billions to create.
That's called small scale nuclear.
Small scale, yeah.
That's a very, very important comment and contribution, Carol, because that up until now, a nuclear plant was a large facility and needed to be adjacent to a large body of water in order to produce. Today, we can build small scale nuclear plants, which are not cooled by water, they're cooled by liquid sodium. And those can be packaged and dropped down almost any place in the absence of water and can be extremely helpful in supplying energy in remote parts of the world. So that's a very, very important observation. Are there any other technologies on the horizon that may show their face, Ron?
Well, fusion, which for the first time about a month ago, we actually produced a little bit more energy than we had to put in to create the fusion. I know that someday fusion will be important, but I don't see it really that close. It seems like it's a long way off, but when we get there, we'll need it. So
How long have we been working on fusion?
Oh, yeah, back then, as far as I know, it's back to the 60s. 70s.
Yeah, 60s. The lab was started in Princeton. And so far, we've been able to produce a microscopic, almost immeasurable amount of energy after 65 years. So don't hold your breath.
100 years, another 40, but whenever it occurs that we solve this, we'll need it.
Wow. Okay, but I think we've spent enough time trying to understand energy. Let's move on the economy or politics, what's the linkage between energy and the economy? Does it have any effect? We talked about supply and demand. Does energy have anything to do with inflation?
All interrelated,
Pardon me?
all interrelated.
All interrelated, how? I mean, we've established the fact that energy is a component in everything we do. So if energy prices go up, what's gonna happen?
If you look at inflation, for instance, in the US, the policies in the US changed in 21, and in the beginning of 2021, we had 1.4 or 1.5% of inflation in the US. At the end of the year, we had like 7% of inflation. And I think the interesting part there is to see that the three major economies in Europe, they were also getting more inflation, high inflation, but that was lagging 2 or 3 months behind. And so I think that shows that policy can change, can affect the economy.
So that all happened before Russia invaded Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
A year ago. So what changed? What caused it?
I think it was the fiscal policy in the US, and it was the negative approach on or attitude to fossil fuels.
And what effect did that have on oil and gas, which then had affected inflation?
I think that, for instance, you know, you had the oil companies being less or being more reluctant to invest in future activities with fossil fuel. They maybe look more into renewable products. And then with the shortage, then fuel prices came up, and in the US we have so much being transported by trucks, for instance, and with the price of diesel going up, it affected everything along the chain of distribution.
Yeah, I want to go back to the comment that was made earlier about supply and demand, and if we repealed those laws or not. That one of the things that did happen with the beginning of the new administration is there was, if you will, an attack on fossil fuels, which had the effect of diminishing supply. But we were just coming out of COVID at that point in time, so it was at a time when demand was accelerated. So if you reduce supply in the face of accelerating demand, what's likely to happen to price?
It goes up.
Yeah, and so, you know, we don't have to look to Putin and Russia and Ukraine to figure out why the price of oil and gasoline and distillate and other fuels rose dramatically in the first 6 months of the administration. It was basically government policies that occasioned that. And one of the things that people often miss on this, because they look at it from a physical standpoint, where else did the administration really put the pressure on the oil industry? I'm going to tell you the answer. It's finance. Everything in the oil industry needs constant financing. It's a huge business, and whether you're talking about the production side or the refining side, and we haven't said a thing about refining, but a refinery is like a farmer's axe that's had 3 new heads and 2 new handles. It needs to be constantly renewed because of the high corrosive materials that are going through that. And if you all of a sudden curtail or make more difficult the financing, which is what this administration did, this makes it difficult.
And the permit process. And the permit process.
The leasing process, the pipeline process, there's a lot of components to this. But I don't really want to go into all of that. Why is energy important from an international standpoint? What does our ability to either supply energy to the rest of the world or provide them the technology, why is that important?
One big reason is that when oil really took off in Arabia and in Oklahoma and Texas, you poke a hole in the ground and you get a whole bunch of oil. Not terribly difficult. When fracking came in, it became a lot more expensive to get the oil out of the shale. And so there was a lot of shale, but sometimes it wasn't very cost effective
Well,
to get it.
you're absolutely right, but I think a big factor was an awful lot of the people who got into fracking and shale early were small producers who
Yeah,
needed to
right.
constantly get their financing re-established. They weren't, it wasn't Mobil and Exxon and Shell and BP and people like that. It was Chesapeake Energy and much smaller companies that really needed constant sources of financing. And you take away the financing, you dry up their activity. Doug?
Well, many of our allies, mainly in Europe, and I'm sure in other parts of the world, need oil because they're independent on it being imported. So it's important for those who have oil to export it. That keeps the whole world's economy running.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And were we exporting much oil prior to this, Bob? I'm sorry, okay.
A little from the West Coast in Alaska.
Yeah, but let's go back to LNG. Where we were, most of the gas that was produced in the United States was domestically consumed. And all of a sudden, we started having enough excess gas that we could liquefy it and ship it to other locations. How has that been important, particularly with respect to when Putin cut off the gas to Western Europe? How did they respond?
They look to us to supply them, which is, and it takes a while to get it going because you have to build huge ports to import it, ships to make it.
We and others were going to supply them, but had they invested in
No.
infrastructure to receive
Made
it?
a mistake.
Okay, and there are a lot of things, you never want to waste a crisis. And this is a crisis that all of a sudden caused people with a wake-up call, and they've done a lot of constructive things in the last 12 to 18 months that they might not have done had this not have taken place. So there's some constructive things that are coming out of it. Nancy?
Well, I thought it was interesting that the comment in the article about the choice that Europe made to be more and more dependent on the pipelines from Russia. And I think this map of UK and EU countries, gas imports and the percentage is really kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah.
But it doesn't say anything about the background, there was not any detail about the geopolitical decision-making that went with that. We now know what the consequence was. And I think if there's a lesson anywhere, it's you can never be that dependent, especially on an unstable country like Russia.
Did we change our attitude vis-a-vis Russia as a result of their incursion into Ukraine?
Absolutely.
As a supplier?
Yeah, because I think we were thinking more on the economic front, which tends to be our.
Yeah, we would say we're talking about Western Europe.
Well, I think the US and Western Europe had an attitude that, oh, there's this big supply now in Russia, and the economic factors overweighed all of the underlying danger of doing that.
So we had some notion that Russia might be a little bit unstable, but we were willing to overlook that because of the economics.
Exactly, and I think that motivated the Western Europeans as well.
And what did that mean? Did that affect our advice to Germany in building Nord
Stream 2?
And so when we finally said, yeah, that's probably okay.
Did we ever say that? Did we ever really support Nord Stream 2?
I don't think we ever really supported it, but we said, well, if you really want to.
I think that our foreign policy and our foreign directive to Germany was, don't be that dependent upon Russia.
Yeah.
And we were not in favor of Nord Stream 2, and that goes through many administrations. It wasn't Republican or Democratic policy, it was a national policy. Nick?
I was gonna say that the countries that produce or have oil, you need to look at the impact of the societies in those countries. You look at Venezuela, Nigeria, the Middle East, and most of the profits have gone to the leadership, or basically it's created very corrupt societies. And I think that needs to be considered as part of this pie.
And in our recent attempt to get more energy to the United States, we've turned to places like Venezuela, like Iran.
Right.
Is that a sound international policy?
I don't know.
Ron?
Well,
That's a good question.
just wanted to say how much the oil situation today is changing foreign policy. You go, look, we try to shut off Russian oil exports by putting in sanctions. So what's happening now? We're having countries like India, which we once I looked at as an ally of ours, South Africa, which we also thought was ally, now buying the Russian oil. I mean, China is also.
And why are they doing that?
What?
Why are they doing that? To spite us?
They're getting the oil which they need, and it's since Russia is not selling it to Europe, they're selling it to these other countries.
But is there incentive for those countries to buy?
Yeah,
that
it's
oil? Cheaper. How's that happening? I thought oil was an international commodity.
But it depends on the day.
Yes.
Pardon me?
It depends on the day.
No, it's not,
and
it
the
depends on more
situation.
than that.
Russia has to support its economy by exporting oil, and if it isn't to Europe, then it'll go elsewhere at a cheaper rate.
Haven't we put caps on Russian oil that can be exported?
Yeah, $60 a barrel.
$60 a barrel. And how do we manage to do that?
Think we got the agreement of most of the consuming countries, except maybe India and China, to agree with us on.
Well, why wouldn't, if India was a consumer, why wouldn't they say, oh, it's 60, let's do 40?
I can't answer that.
The way we did it was by trying to control the infrastructure, by the shipping that is necessary to get the oil out of Russia to places like South Africa and India. That depends on private tankers, which depends upon the insurance industry. And we indicated we weren't going to insure, the insurance lobby wasn't going to insure anything above $60 a barrel. Oh,
What I understand was that the Indians, they were refining the oil into other products. So they shipped chemical products and they were allowed to ship those. So they used the cheap oil to create a new market for them.
well, India has a absolutely unquenchable appetite for energy at this point in time. They have a growing population. The population is trying to move desperately from poverty to the middle class to an upper class. Desperate, as we started this discussion, energy is the lifeblood. They need that energy. Okay, and if they can get Russian oil for $60 a barrel, as opposed to oil on the international market for $85 a barrel, India has never been a strong United States ally. They've always had one foot in each camp. They have been one foot in the Russian camp with respect to arms, one foot in the China camp with respect to other supplies, and one foot in the American camp. They've played a very delicate balance since their independence of trying to play both sides against the middle, and they do it very successfully. I'm not sure that's going to last, and we talked about that in the past about foreign policy in the Southeast Asia, but that's another subject for another day. Is energy? We talked about supply chains. How does that translate into the future? Not just the supply chains for oil and gas today, but think ahead. What are the technologies that are important in the future, and how does that affect supply chains? Nancy.
Well, it's the battery, I think, the lithium, all the, what do they call them? Natural minerals or? It seemed to result.
Okay,
I don't know if it is true, but I seem to recall that China is the repository of the most of those in the world, and
Afghanistan.
And Congo.
There's a lot of sources of rare earths.
We have.
China has an abundance. We have a lot of it too.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, you've got to dig up a ton of ore in order to get an ounce of rare earth. And we don't want to go digging up the whole state of Nevada.
Yeah.
So we say, well, let somebody else do it. But more importantly than where are the rare earths dug? What else? What has to be done to a rare earth ore in order to convert it into a usable product?
Let's call it chemical refining.
Refining, exactly. It's got to be processed. And where is the processing of all that activity take place?
Right now,
China.
That's really the Achilles heel here, is that China has a lock on 60 to 80% of all the processing capacity for rare earth elements like magnesium, lithium, cobalt, graphite, etc., which are needed for battery technology, for wind technology, for solar technology, etc. And so what we're learning today from the supply chain disruption with regard to oil and gas we sure as hell ought to be thinking a little bit ahead and saying, you know, that could happen in terms of these rare earths too, and we need to protect ourselves. Doug,
This is a little bit going back to the prior question that's related to the future. And that is when the Ukrainian thing is resolved, Russia still has all that oil. We have American companies over in Russia.
anymore.
No, Chevron left?
Everybody has exited Russia.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But won't the world want to get back into Russia again because it has this materials? And is that an issue related to this whole topic?
They have the resources, but what do they lack at this point in time? The technology.
Technology.
The
And they're
Russia,
losing more of it.
Russia does not have modern technology. And most of the technology that has been used to extract the minerals from Russia has been Western supplied. And I'm not sure the West is going to be terribly anxious to go back in and help Russia reinvigorate their oil industry unless it's part of an overall settlement. I mean, we can get into this on another time, but one of the elements of a settlement in Ukraine is going to be reparations. And the only way Russia is going to be able to pay reparations with respect to Ukraine is by producing their oil and gas. Because that's where I mean, I said this before when we were talking about it. Russia is a gas station with an army. And the only way that they really can supply foreign exchange is through extraction of their oil and gas. Okay, let's move on to climate change. Go ahead.
I had a comment about the rare earth. As someone mentioned, it's a very long process and it's far away. In Sweden, they made a discovery recently of 1 million tons of rare earth oxides. And that's the largest known deposit of its kind in Europe. And but it will take 10 to 15 years before they can mine it. And this is a byproduct of the iron ore mining they have. But they will start in a town in northern Luleå where they already have existing iron ore extraction to develop a process for getting also phosphorus, but also rare earth out of these products that they normally just put in landfills. But that will not be available until, say, 2027. So it's far ahead of it. But this 1 million tons that Sweden found, that will be sufficient for Western Europe, for their batteries, for vehicles, and for the magnets for the batteries, for vehicles and for windmills or wind power.
Will the Swedish population go along with the production of these rare earths, even though it means destruction of a lot of property? Okay.
No, I think so, since it's a byproduct already from the iron ore extraction. So it will be a win-win situation, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very important add to this discussion, folks, because that is probably the largest discovery that has been made in the last 25 years or so. I mean, we know where there are rare earths in the United States and in other parts of the world, but you know, digging them up is problematical.
Oh, I couldn't hear, which elements are there within the discovery?
What was the question?
Yeah, which are the elements that are part of that discovery in Sweden?
I can't hear the question. What
elements like lithium, cobalt, manganese?
Right. No, what they are getting, rare earth oxides out from the production of iron ore.
It's primarily
Rare earth oxide.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
all right, let's shift gears, time is running, to climate change, and then we'll try to put them all together. There is a presumed correlation between fossil fuel production and climate change through the exploration of CO2. We have spent a great deal of time and money in this country and throughout the rest of the world trying to mitigate, trying to reduce the level of CO2, not particularly successful up until now. We've had various conferences starting in Kyoto and Paris and so on down the line. What's another strategy that could be employed as opposed to simply trying to reduce CO2? Ron?
Well, you can do the newer science of capturing the CO2 and keeping it out of the atmosphere. And what we're not doing, I think, right now with climate control we're, like you say, cutting back on our fossil fuel to try to help climate control, but yet I'm starting to look at this as with this, right now, the United States supply of fossil fuel is one of the leaders in the world. As we cut this back, it's almost like we're disarming. We're not getting rid of our tanks, but if we get rid of our oil, and we're then left with worrying about the lithium and the cobalt and so forth, and we're not prepared in this country to do that. What I see is a country like China going into Africa, the way Roosevelt went to Saudi Arabia for oil, the Chinese are now doing this on these rare earth elements, which are needed. And like you say, we're not prepared to dig up the United States where we do have this stuff, but we're not prepared to dig it up. So I'm getting very nervous about the fact that in the next 50 years, we're getting rid of our defense and we're disarming unilaterally.
Okay.
To some degree,
No, Bob first, please.
to some degree, it's a contradiction because the basic thing is more demand for energy than ever before.
Right.
So you have a transition theoretically to renewables. At the same time, there's an increase for fossil fuels.
Well, there's an increase, there's a demand for total energy regardless of where it comes
Right,
from.
exactly.
Okay,
But for instance, in addition to oil, other forms of energy are now demand. And India is importing coal, and other nations are importing coal. So you have that's the contradiction. We have the growth of coal and oil at the same time as the transition.
and are we managing that transition well at this point in time, in your judgment?
No.
What are we doing to manage it or not to manage it? The
Well,
transition, we're trying in this country to move from fossil fuel economy to a clean economy. Okay, that requires a transition and that requires change. And as I indicated, change is disruptive. Okay, it's always disruptive, and rapid change, uncontrolled change can be catastrophic. And we've been going through an exercise here that may be more term catastrophic than anything else. Doug.
I know there's a lot of technical time and money spent on looking at several options, including everything we talked about before, wind and thermal and everything like that. So this is not the transition, the way to deal with this is a multi-pronged approach. You've got to spend money to develop the new technology better and implement it, including hardening the electric grid and all that sort of thing. For you to make the transition, it's not any one solution. However, there is a best solution in my judgment, and that's the sodium nuclear reactor. It's from what I've seen, read about it, it's safe because you don't spread water in case of an accident. And you can always put them in cities. Everything can be very tightly contained if there's an accident. I don't know what the cost factors are to make them or the difficulty. They can also power a local grid if you want to get down to not having to transmit power all over the place and put down power lines. It seems like a no-brainer to me, but this country doesn't seem to be, at least from what I read in the newspapers and the magazines, I haven't seen anything done about this from the US.
Carol.
It will require enormous financing of the great powers to the underdeveloped world.
Okay.
Because it's the underdeveloped world that will still be.
Should we do that?
We have to in order to save.
We're not
the world.
doing anything.
You're talking about the future now and future planning.
So that's something we should be doing at some point in time in the future.
We have to consider it because they are using coal and have greater needs as the health, because they have increased health now, they have greater populations that require more energy.
Why are we not taking advantage of this nuclear solution? It's very clear that Doug is right, that the nuclear reactor is a major contributor to reduce the climate problem. Why aren't we doing it?
Bloomberg recently had a conference where they invited all sorts of companies to give best practices of what they are developing. And it will take the timing and financing of all of these budding and emerging technologies. And that's where we are right now.
Do you think the major obstacle is finance rather than public reaction?
I think the public can be led along with the right components.
Ron, and then
Well,
Nancy.
what Doug says is
Yeah.
very true. I mean, we discussed nuclear power here before, and we've all agreed that it's an important
Right.
component. And these small reactors are very safe and we should be doing it. But before even thinking about helping other countries do it, we have to do it ourselves. Because then if we can replace our oil dominance by nuclear dominance, then we can disarm on the oil front. But right now, until we.
What's holding us back?
we can't. Well,
What's holding us back?
Image.
well,
That's right. Yeah, I think what I wanted to put on the table. Politics. In other words, if you're going to have any policy that encourages new industries and new solutions, you have to have some coherence in the policy. And I think even globally, but certainly in this country, we're busy fighting between the tree huggers and the scientists and the economists. And unless you do, I think, all of those things, in other words, unless you have really sound economic models based on sound scientific data about the options available and the costs and the return on the investment, I think we're stuck. We're just stuck with a lot of noise about how big the impact is on climate, how expensive it is up front. But if we don't package it, it seems to me that this is a real policy and political dilemma.
Isn't that called leadership?
Yes,
And so, you know, we just don't have the kind of leadership that's gonna get us from A to B.
right.
Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, I was gonna say that the allure of free energy is obscuring, in my mind, the discussions on the real solutions. You know, solar, wind,
Are they
all
free?
all that comes free, and that to me is.
Actually, the price of generating energy using solar or wind is at least 4 times to 5 times unsubsidized the price of generating it with fossil fuels. So it's certainly not free.
Okay.
I mean, once you get the infrastructure in place, the wind blows free.
Right.
But when you take a look at the total cost of putting in a solar or a photovoltaic energy panel, it's unsubsidized. It's about 20 cents a kilowatt hour, as opposed to about a nickel a kilowatt hour for fossil fuels. Charles.
Interesting.
Going back to nuclear, I think probably what it would require, I think. For commercially, I think the investment would be too great for any company. So it would require the government to do perhaps for nuclear what they're doing for wind and solar and so forth, which is to DARPA is going to sit and perfect it and then let it go out. It would require a government and it would be worth doing. But I think there is this.
So is it just one government, the United States, that's going to fund all this?
Well, I think that probably other governments should do it too, but the United States has taken the lead in so many other things, and that's what, when we invested in a lot of science and technology is a lot of what gave us the continued lead in this world. So we could do that. But I think there's psychological that there are so many people who are still spooked by nuclear, which is, you know, totally off base, doesn't make any difference. There is resistance to it, but I think it would require DARPA, would require government subsidy to do the basic research because industry can't afford it.
Doug?
This research has already been done, okay? Bill Gates financed half of it. And he wanted to go to China to build an initial reactor based on old technology back from the 1939 era. He took all this is sodium technology, which is what encapsulates everything, makes it a lot safer. And the government wouldn't let him. Maybe that was a good idea because that is going to China to test it, build it, because the Chinese could have stolen the technology. I don't think we do anything regarding, we have to be very careful on who a partner would be. And you know, maybe the Brits, because they're the most reliable ally that we have in the world. But it's, you gotta be very careful to develop it outside this country. But anyway, it has been developed. It needs to be built and prototype to test. That's the stage.
Right, and then government would be, it would have to do
Would
that.
be
because I don't think
good.
any individual company would be prepared to make that
I
investment.
think we all agree that one of the dilemmas we have right now is conflict between climate change on the one side and energy development or energy production on the other. That just seems to be an insurmountable obstacle that we're having a hell of a time trying to figure out how to get over. I'm going to impanel you all now. You are now the United States panel on electrification of sub-Saharan Africa. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and others have come up and they've said, we're going to supply you trillions of dollars of funds. We're going to fund it. But we want you to build power plants in sub-Saharan Africa using conventional technology. We estimate that that's going to raise the temperature by 1/10 of 1 degree Fahrenheit. According to the IPCC, we've already raised the temperature 1.1 degree Fahrenheit from pre-industrial. With the breakup point is 1.5. This is going to take us from 1.1 to 1.2. It will, on the other hand, save millions of lives in sub-Saharan Africa because they need it desperately for farming, for housing, for electrification, for schools, for transportation, for everything. You know, this is the most pressing human need that we have on the planet today, and this is the fastest growing country, fastest growing continent on the planet today. So the sooner we bring them into the 20th century, much less the 21st century, the better it's going to be for those people. How would you vote on that if you would say, okay, we're going to have to compromise on climate, but we're going to do an awful lot of good for an awful lot of people? Carol.
So at the Bloomberg conference that drew large and small participants together, they said, what we need is something small, mobile, inexpensive, that can go into a tent and supply energy.
Okay, and we've got that. We have package boilers using
But
coal.
now it's the financing and.
Okay, we got the financing. That's coming from Warren Buffett and
And
his
the
associates.
production should also be spread out, but not coming.
Okay, but how are we gonna, are we gonna go ahead and take the money and electrify sub-Saharan Africa and save millions of lives and raise a tremendous number of people on this planet up to 20th century standards? Or are we gonna say, no, climate change is too important, we're not gonna do that?
As part of your question, does South Africa have any resources of itself?
Absolutely, but they don't have the fossil fuels which are required. That's going to come from Libya by pipeline. It's going to be coal from South Africa. You know, there are resources there, but and it's going to come from Nigeria on the refining side. But at the end of the day, we're going to raise the temperature by 1/10 of 1 degree Fahrenheit centigrade. But we're going to do a tremendous amount of good for it. How do you feel, Doug?
I'd just like to start here first. That's all. Start here first, test it, make sure it works before it goes there. I agree that that's a noble cause on their part. And if those American oligarchs want to.
But we're talking about using fossil fuels. We're not talking about anything else.
Oh, fossil fuels. Oh, no, I don't think that's the
No,
way.
but the point you are ably making is the conundrum.
Yeah,
That's it.
and I want to know how we resolve that. Will we tolerate a 1/10 of 1 degree increase in the temperature in order to absolutely bring millions of people out of poverty and solve health problems, welfare problems, education problems, food insecurity, you name it, they got it.
Which will impact and increase more floods, more billions of dollars worth of dislocation of people.
So we shouldn't do it.
It's not that we shouldn't, it gets back to what the conundrum is.
It's not an
And
easy
that-
question.
Well, if you use oil to do
And
it,
it
that's
has
my
to be
gripe.
piecemeal.
But you shouldn't use existing technology, oil and gas to do it.
So what should we do?
You have to use new technology, which could be solar, I don't know, could be wind, and it could be nuclear. You use a combination of new technology. It's like, why would you put an old style 1960s airport in South Africa? You
Because that's
wouldn't.
what we know how to
You put
build.
brand new, newest technology. You use the newest stuff to do it, but that newest stuff has to be tested first.
So
Well, I would do it, but at the same time, I would say, okay, I'm raising the temperature a little bit, but I'm helping these people. But at the same time, I'd also be investing in carbon capture and other scientific ways to stop that 1/10 of a degree, maybe 20 years from now. I mean, I'll tolerate it right now because I'll do good for the
We'll
people.
solve that problem tomorrow.
And I
How
know
do I
the
make it
science,
louder?
I know the science will solve the problem tomorrow.
Okay,
They've solved a lot of other problems.
so you'd be in favor of going ahead?
Yes.
Okay,
Okay, you have to mute me.
Doris, could you turn yourself off, please? Doug, I want to go back to, because I'd like you to push me to think outside the box a little bit here. I think I would go back to Gates and his allies and say, listen, we don't want to use old technology. Why don't we use these packaged nuclear boilers to, and we'll insert them into sub-Saharan Africa. So we do two things. One, we solve the greatest need that we've got in the world today, which is to electrify Southern Africa. But two, we do it not with fossil fuels. We use nuclear as the device, which would solve a lot of things. And if we did electrify sub-Saharan Africa with small scale nuclear plants, it would be a demonstration for the rest of the world as to the viability, feasibility of this technology. Charles.
First of all, let me say, I totally agree with you. We would, if you, I think it's important to do it. There's another question that if we're dealing with potential mass migration of populations, which can destabilize the rest of the world. So it becomes vitally important, not just from a humanitarian point of view, that the growing population in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the largest area of population growth, be allowed to stay there, and the way to make them stay there is to electrify and to raise their standard of living so they don't have to move. But I agree with you, then the answer is not to use old technology. The answer would be to use, and that's a great place to invest the money into new technology. So to kill two birds with one stone.
I think the point is, we need to be smart enough to solve both problems, or at least to address both problems simultaneously, and not see A as the enemy of B or B as the enemy of A. We've got to be a little more thoughtful and get out of the box on issues like that, or we're going to continue spinning our wheels on climate change, on nuclear, on all of this stuff that we've been discussing. I want to switch gears again because we're starting to run out of time. The introduction to the DVD suggested that there were 4 different viewpoints that you could use in looking at the foreign policy aspects of issues like this. And this will permeate our discussions for the next 7 times. They were the Realpolitik, liberal, neoconservative, and America First. Did everybody get a chance to see the DVD?
Yeah.
Were pigeonholes or labels such as that helpful in terms of your discussing this material? And do you think it'll be helpful going forward?
I thought it was excellent.
Okay, and what helped you in terms of the energy discussion of having these buckets to put things in?
Well, I can see how different opinions in this different situation. The only comment I'd have is that I didn't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. I saw the liberal position could also be the conservative position.
That's right.
Yes.
So it's very conflicting. It was helpful.
I think, it's simplistic to suggest that there were 4 mutually exclusive buckets. And there was no overlap in between them, because I found a lot of overlap in between them. I didn't think that putting labels on issues and problems was particularly constructive, but we're going to have to deal with that as we go forward. So I want to make sure we all have an understanding of what that is. Nancy.
Well, I'd like to go back to your earlier question about leadership, or your comment, because anyone, no matter which of these you are embracing or representing or putting in the mix, you need to have a way of engaging your so-called public support. And where the dilemma lies in the conundrum we just described is, if the people who are for climate change and who are responsive to what it takes to make that viable represent a major stumbling block if we have international agreements about that. And so I think a leadership issue, no matter which of these you subscribe to, is critical to saying sometimes we have to trade something off,
Right.
or sometimes we have to collaborate in ways we've not done before, and so on. The only other point I wanted to make is on the sub-Sahara. I don't think electric power is a sufficient solution. You have a reducing livable area geographically. So if you power up and you have no water, you're still
You power up and you can drill wells and you can pump water.
good, okay.
No, I mean, it
Yeah.
really, if you can electrify sub-Saharan Africa, almost all of the problems that they have, and God knows in East Africa, in Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, I mean, their problems are incredible. But electrification would make a huge, huge difference to every part of their standard of living, from food to water, shelter to you name it.
But I think-
Transportation, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think it really comes back to what you were saying before about what was given as the four alternatives, which I, as Dan knows, I sort of don't agree with the way you defined it. But it is significant in the sense that we're talking about the United States taking a lead in helping foreign areas or areas outside our country to our benefit. And this does lead into issues that are current now, which is, we'll go back to the America First, which is really more that we just take care of ourselves, and the rest of the world can take care of themselves, and we're not going to invest anything anywhere.
No, it's America first, not America only.
No, right,
It's America first, not America only.
But however, right now, you see with America First, you see this, which is about the Ukraine, we don't care about NATO. I mean, there's a faction of the conservative one wing of the Republican Party now, and possibly a liberal wing of the Democratic Party as well, which says we don't need to get involved. NATO can take care of themselves. We'll cut back on the Ukraine. So that and this goes back historically.
Okay, I'm not sure that's, necessarily the case, but we're again running out of time. I want to introduce one other thought here. There's a different philosophy in terms of climate change that is gaining some traction, and that is mitigation as opposed to CO2 elimination.
And adaptation.
And well, the same thing.
Well, no, they're not the same thing.
Well,
Mitigation is to diminish the impact. Adaptation is how we live with it.
okay, all right. I put them both in the same bucket, but mitigation, adaptation as opposed to elimination. How do you feel about that? And one of the attributes of adaptation mitigation is that you spend billions of dollars hardening your infrastructure, but you see the results. You know it works. Okay, we spend trillions of dollars on CO2 elimination, and we're not sure we get anything out of it because it takes the cooperation of the rest of the world to get a true result. So should we be thinking more seriously about adaptation or mitigation as opposed to elimination? Yes, Dean.
To quote a famous philosopher, it takes a crisis to make things happen.
Never waste a crisis.
So maybe we should spend our time thinking about what kind of a crisis would we like to have best?
Does anybody think what's going on between Ukraine and Russia is a crisis?
Yeah.
I do.
I
Yeah, so you have a crisis that has been inflicted upon Western Europe by Russia, by Putin. And let's see if we can't extract something good out of that.
Jack, with your question, you're talking about the US policy or worldwide?
We're talking about world geopolitics at this point in time.
Production?
Yeah, and it certainly applies to the US. I mean, we could spend a lot of money in Lower Manhattan, hardening the subways, hardening the infrastructure, hardening the grid system, and making sure that if we have another tsunami type hurricane, that the subways will continue to run and we're not going to wipe out all of the tunnels. That would have a demonstrable effect. We'd be spending a lot of money, but we could see that we were doing some good.
Yeah, that's adaptation.
Adaptation. Okay.
It's very different from mitigation, definitely. Mitigation is you
We'll
stop,
fight about that later.
you stop the amount of pollution in the air.
No, I
That's
understand. But I'm just suggesting there are ways in which we can spend our money and get tangible results as opposed to spending our money in hopes that the rest of the world is going to come along with us, which doesn't look like a very likely prospect at this point in time. Yes.
I
Lynn.
just have a question. We've talked about the small nuclear thing.
Mhm.
Is what country is leading the way on building any of these?
No.
I don't think anyone is, right?
No, it's just private.
Doing some.
What about China?
Small scale.
What was that?
Is
Sidle.
Yeah, what about China? Aren't they really building nuclear plants? I thought they did. And
Well,
if
they
you
have
take,
it.
and if you have
They have
nuclear
nuclear
plants, I
plants.
mean, if it's 1 million more time energy than if you're burning coal.
And where is the greatest source of uranium?
Russia
In
and
Africa.
Africa.
Yeah.
Russia and Africa. So I mean, here we are
Well,
talking.
hold on. The technology, as I understand it, uses spent fuel. And there's more spent fuel in this country than you can possibly imagine, which we have no place to put. And so that's another advantage of this technology, as I understand it.
Okay, what are the foreign policy implications of everything that we're discussing here from the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world?
And what are our options? What are our foreign policy options? We're using sanctions, right? That's a foreign policy option.
That doesn't seem to be working.
Have sanctions ever worked?
No,
No.
Basically.
they look good though.
What are the options for which problem? I want to get that clear in my mind.
No, I mean, we've got an energy situation and a climate situation that have economic implications. And we have to decide, we as the United States, what are the foreign policy implications of how we address the rest of the world on these topics? Go ahead.
I don't think you can ask the question seems to me a broader one. Your foreign policy depends on, to some success, that the success that you're having in your own country, because there's usually dollars attached to foreign relations. So you almost have to come back to how can we find, even if we had a solution, we have to find also at the same time, a place to generate the money to do it. So it seems to me like that you don't want to have to cart before the horse. Maybe I'm backwards on that, but I think you need to start with a different taxation policy in the US, frankly, to help raise the money to be able to afford to do a lot of the things that you want to do, helping other countries. I don't know how to solve Ukraine other than that's a side number. If you took a little bit of curve off the eastern side of Ukraine, you might, as a part of a compromise, get that to happen.
Okay, but there are foreign policy implications to what we're doing today in Ukraine that have both climate as well as energy components to them. Are we doing the right thing? Should we be doing more? Should we be doing less?
I think we're doing just the right thing, supplying munitions and equipment.
And how about our foreign policy actions toward the third world, if you will, toward sub-Saharan Africa, toward India, toward the rest of Southeast Asia? And what are the implications for our relationships with China?
It's too big a question for me to answer in 2 minutes. I can't do that.
Well, I mean, the issue is almost everything that we're doing and talking about here does have foreign policy implications. It has an implication as to how we are regarded in the rest of the world, how we treat the rest of the world, how we handle the rest of the world. And I think that it's very important to think about that seriously. What's friend sharing all about? What that was a term that came up in the reading. What does that imply?
I would say it implies that trying, since we cannot produce everything here, try to move the supply chain to countries that are friendly to us, which might be Canada, Mexico, things in this continent, and not be dependent on countries that are potential adversaries of ours for vital sources. So
I think it also implies that we help our allies.
Yeah.
That if we have an abundance of resources, that we also help our allies.
Yeah.
Okay. We're running out of time, and I'd like to have the observers have a chance to chime in if they either have things to say or questions to ask or comments to make. So if any of you who are on Zoom, if you now want to unmute yourself, I'm not going to be able to see all your faces, so try to raise your hand or just give us your question or your comment, if you will. Anyone on Zoom who have something to add to our discussion?
I think Joyce Weiser.
Yes, I did have one question, and that's about the new nuclear facilities that you're talking about. Is there still the problem with nuclear waste that we have with the old ones?
Not so much. Most of the material in a small scale sodium cooled nuclear plant will be consumed. And you're not going to produce the amount of waste that is coming out of a conventional nuke. I'm not going to say it's zero, but it's a much lower proportion of the fuel that went in.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments?
Answers to Jack's questions?
Questions to Jack's answers?
Well, I'll say I have no answers, but I thought you did a great job. It was very interesting.
Right. Well, before we end the session, we talked a little bit earlier about the first OPEC crisis and the first oil embargo, and it was occasioned by the Yom Kippur War. That was the first time where all of a sudden we realized OPEC's power, and we realized our vulnerability and our insecurity with respect to oil. We have with us today someone who lived that. I lived it from the oil industry side, but we had somebody who lived it from the military side. So I'd like to ask Nick to give his comments in terms of what was going on in the Yom Kippur War. Nick?
Okay, thank you. Well, I was flying C-141s at the time, and
Nick, speak up, please.
okay, I was flying a cargo airplane called the C-141 at the time out of Tacoma, Washington. And all of a sudden I found myself alerted and in this airlift to Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. And the kind of the background of the background of the start of this was that Golda Meir threatened to put nuclear tipped missiles on the F-4s that Israel had. And that was not acceptable to the Nixon administration on this side of the world. So we decided that at first, you know, it was a let's call it a sudden war. All of a sudden the tanks were rolling across the desert from Egypt and Syria, and Israel was in big trouble. Europe did not want to help, but we decided because of the nuclear threat that we would help. So what the Kissinger went first to the Defense Department and said, well, let's see if we can get civil carriers to support Israel, and none of them would, because they thought that they didn't want to lose the business they were getting from the Middle East. Basically, they were carrying passenger or workers in and out, and oil rigs and things like that was there, and they were afraid that they would lose that. So the next step was to turn to the Military Airlift Command, who had the C-5A Galaxy and the C-141 Starlifter to do it. We needed an interim base to get there, and only Portugal showed any interest at all at providing a base. So we ended up in lodges, and then flying down the Mediterranean, I think, to Ben Gurion Airport. The US Navy put ships every 300 miles down the middle of the Mediterranean, with an aircraft carrier every 600 miles, you know, down the Mediterranean. And then when the airplanes got within 150 miles and started the descent into Ben Gurion Airport, the Israeli fighters provided protection for the airlift. But at the same time, when we were descending into Ben Gurion, you could see the Russian transports descending, almost crossing paths into Cairo. And basically the airlift lasted about 30 days. And there was probably every hour there would be an aircraft arriving into Tel Aviv. And I talked to basically when I did the talk in the auditorium about the reception we got in Tel Aviv and how the meal that was provided for us or whatever. It was about a 6-hour flight in from lodges into Tel Aviv. Then you had to turn around in an hour and then fly back. So basically I ended up drinking a lot of Matus wine in lodges. But when I got when the war was over and I got back and I just saw all these gas lines and things, I didn't connect the dots because I had been 30 days back and forth, totally exhausted and whatever. I just didn't have any news or sense of what was going on in the world. So I didn't really know until well into the fuel crisis why the OPEC had basically cut our fuel supplies off. So anyway, that's a bit of my experiences, and I just thought I'd share that with the group.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It is noon, and I think
Yeah.
we do need to honor the fact that people want to move on. Do you have some urgent questions? Maybe you could
Nancy,
take
want
it
to know
offline
what we
with
were
Nick?
carrying? C-141s were carrying ammunition, and the C-5As were carrying artillery and tanks and things in there. So, after the war, the Air Force decided, look, they modified the C-141s to be aerial refueling. Because we couldn't count on the bases, and the C-5A basically showed its worth. That big airplane was worth it.
If you have other questions for Nick, perhaps you can take them offline because
Okay,
we are
gotta go.
past our time, but I do want to, just one comment for the rest of the season. We had a really special resource in what Jack knows about energy. And so he was able to answer your questions as well as to ask them. But our role is only to ask questions. So I just want to
Yeah.
alert you that for the remaining 7 sessions, we don't have the answers. You have to have the answers. We will have the questions. So don't count on us to solve these problems for you. But
Thanks, Jack.
that was a
Good job.
magnificent.
Right.
Just one last tag on the Yom Kippur War. Well, you were struggling with the military aspects of it. We in the industry were struggling with the
Yes.
inventory aspect of it. Everybody in the United States decided they needed to fill their tank and keep it filled.
Yeah.
You take 10 gallons, a 20-gallon tank,
Yeah,
normally filled half full, now it's gonna be filled, that's 10 gallons per car, for in fact 80 million cars.
Yeah.
That's one hell of a lot of gasoline that was sucked out of our supply chain, and we had to refill it in order to keep the lines down at the gas stations.
Understand.
It was this big.
What?
Just a quick comment.
73.
Obviously,
Yeah.
Nixon believed Golda Meir's threat,
yes.
but what goes around comes around. We're
Yeah.
back to now Iran and Israel, the same issue.
Same threat.
Okay, thank you.
Got that,
Thank you
yeah.
all.
Right.
And thanks to all of our patient observers. Yes.
Actually,
What's the name of the